Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel on Agile Governance for Innovation and the Sustainable Development Goals during the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a panel sponsored by the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Next. So as you know, the Thunderbird School of Global Management is the vanguard of global leadership, management, and business education for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We prepare future-ready leaders, managers, entrepreneurs, innovators, and policy and global affairs experts across global business and private practices. Next. Next. So another important element to point out here is that the Thunderbird School of Global Management has been ranked the #1, the best one globally by Time Higher Education and the Wall Street Journal for our Master of Global Management. And as we are hosted at Arizona State University, which has also been ranked the best one in the United States for innovation. And this year, we have also been ranked the best one for the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are tremendous accomplishments, as you can see with the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Next. And the vision is really to create sustainable and inclusive prosperity worldwide, created in, so from 1946 to 60, we were founded with the idea of the Marshall Plan. We had a global focus in the 60s, and from the 80s to the 90s, the addition to executive education and online programs. And with the outstanding vision of our new leader, Dean Kagram, we have also had a focus on the Fourth Industrial Revolution with centers of excellence around the world with a goal of achieving 25 of them by 2025. And our mission is to really educate global leaders and managers who will maximize the benefit of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Next. So future-ready digital global mindset include really the mitigation of the challenges and realizing the opportunities associated with the Fourth Industrial Revolution, whether we speak about the ability for initiative, digital skill, entrepreneurship, data reporting skill, or global mindset, problem solver, and lifelong learner. Really, people at Thunderbird are really at the forefront of innovation in terms of being ready, not just for the future, but also for the challenges of today. Next. So our leader, Director General and Dean, Dr. Sanjeev Kagram of the Thunderbird School of Global Management has really brought a phenomenal transformation for the past few years. And he started again with the 75 years of experience developing holistic leader and really to tackle the world's greatest challenges. Thunderbird is really in a unique position to discuss important issues such as the one of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Agile Governance for the Sustainable Development Goals. Next. So today we will discuss with phenomenal leaders who have been at the forefront of the policy, but also the intellectual contribution on agile governance with our collaborator from the World Economic Forum, including Chris Brocard, who is a government affairs lead at the World Economic Forum, Stephen Armand, head of innovation, better regulation executive, as well at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the United Kingdom, and Nima Elmim, who is the head of government affairs as well at the World Economic Forum. And we'll have as well a moderated session followed by a question and answer from the audience. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat during the presentation, and I will be engaging so that our distinguished speaker can really present those. And I am your moderator. I am Landry Signé. I am a Senior Director of the Thunderbird Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Globalization 4.0, as well as a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. I'm also a full professor here at Thunderbird and a Senior Fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution, as well as a Distinguished Fellow at the Stanford University Center for African Study. So, and our next speaker will be, and I will ask them to come on stage as I present them, will be Chris Brocard. Chris Brocard, next slide, please. Chris Brocard is the head of government affairs as the World Economic Forum Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Also a co-author of the forum Trailblazing 2018 paper on Agile governance reimagining policy making in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He also manages the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Agile governance, among other phenomenal accomplishment. Next, Stephen Alman also is a fellow at the World Economic Forum Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He led the UK government's program to transform its regulatory environment to enable innovation. And he's also the architect of its 2019 paper on regulation for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He has been a phenomenal contributor on many aspects of Agile governance, Agile regulation, and we have engaged with Stephen as well as with Chris on many other panel and initiatives around the world. Next, and to finish, we also have Nima Elmi, who is the head of government affairs at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution of the World Economic Forum. Of course, Nima, a YGL, a dear friend, and a phenomenal expert in many things, whether international relations, peace building initiative, governance of emerging technologies, a public intellectual writing phenomenal pieces, and she has been heavily involved in framing the conversation on Agile governance as well. She has been on many lists of incredible achievers, the UK Power List as a rising star, among other YGL, as I pointed out, and graduate from Oxford, Harvard. So name it, Nima is there. So she's definitively the person on how to have on all the panels related to those questions. So perhaps let me just provide a quick introduction to Agile governance, and I'll give the floor to Chris. So as you know, we are really living in a complex world with the increased reign of uncertainty, whether we speak about COVID-19, geopolitics, oil price war, trade war, cybersecurity, climate change issues, nuclear security, financial and monetary systems, which are under stress. And with all those, you have the diffusion of governing powers around the world. So the power is not anymore, policymaking power is not anymore an exclusive domain of policymaker, but from the central government. You have also cities, region, companies, transnational actors, as well as corporations, citizens which are involved in those policy making process. When we combine those with the rise of disruptive technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution, it is which are being brought at a much faster speed that government have been used to innovate, to regulate. It is clear that we really need more flexible, human-centered, agile form of governance and policy making process, requiring as well multi-stakeholder collaboration. So I'll be happy to explain more on this, but we have the one who have crafted those strategy globally for the World Economic Forum. So without taking longer, I will give the floor to Chris, who will be discussing some of those points.
Well, thank you very much, Landry, for such a warm welcome and such a warm introduction of us all. And most of all, for giving us the space to talk about our work and to talk about why agile governance is so important in today's age. We are all representing the World Economic Forum, where we have been working on several topics that are this week also discussed in the timelines of the UN General Assembly. We work on global trade, we work on health, we work on environment. But what is specific about the World Economic Forum is that we look to all of these problems through the lens of public-private collaboration and through the lens of multi-stakeholder collaboration. We think that in today's age, there is a need for governments and for businesses to reach out to each other and to co-design the solutions that we need to bring our society forward. And definitely one of these areas where this is so important is in the area of technology and governance of technology. When I spoke recently to one of our members of our council that came from government, she mentioned a lot of time we as government, we see a new emerging technology, and then as a government, we form an opinion whether it's good for society or bad from society. And from that point, we engage with business, but there is a certain a precondition of how we think about emerging technology. So we think it's very, very important that from the very, very early stage, we bring together the businesses and the governments to really co-design how new technologies are shaping our society. In the chat, one of the people asked, what is the fourth industrial revolution? We ranked the industrial revolutions in the past of this series, starting with the first industrial revolution. That was when steam started to influence our manufacturing processes. The second revolution is the start of using electricity in our society. And the third industrial revolution was when computers started to facilitate and increase the efficiency of our production processes. Now, the fourth industrial revolution is when new technologies such as the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and generally also the big use of data starts to be involved in our production processes. And what was different with the fourth industrial revolution, that it's no longer just about making our society or making processes more efficient, but that it really created a big disruption of existing business models, disruption of supply chains that had been created, and a much bigger impact on our society. Also, we think that the speed at which these new technologies emerge is ever going faster, and that therefore we also need to respond quicker on how we introduce those technologies in our society and become better in analyzing the risks and the opportunities much earlier in the process. And if we are thinking about how do we shape those technologies, then we of course think about governance and policy as a main lever to see how we introduce these technologies in our society. And in all of this, I would say there are two primary things we need to look at. One is the speed at which we develop governance. If those technologies emerge so fast and have such a big impact on our society, then we have to make sure that our governance processes are adopted to that. Standard regulatory processes often take a number of months or even years to develop, and we cannot accommodate that anymore with the speed of emerging technologies. So we really need to look at creative ways to accelerate the pace of policy making. And then the other thing is the coordination problem. As I mentioned, the fourth industrial revolution is not only increasing the efficiency of one specific supply chain, but also makes distinctions between supply chain more blurred, and therefore creates a much bigger need for coordination between different actors, between different departments and governments, but also between governments and businesses, between incumbent businesses that have already established supply chains, and also the technology innovators and the disruptors. And of course, in all of that, we need to make sure that we develop technology for the right purpose, and that we use the ultimate clients, the citizens, in our discussions. And this is what we all try to do when we are designing agile governance for technology. Today, we're focusing a lot on technology, but I would also encourage you to think through all of the principles of agile governance in a wider space and how they can address the sustainable development goals that are so front and center this week, and think of how all of these principles can be used more generally to innovate and to create a better future for us. While we're focusing on technology policy in the last 5 years, we've seen really an acceleration of the interest in agile governance, or in governing an uncertain future with the emergence of COVID-19. COVID-19 is probably the reason why we are able to have this conversation while I sit at home in my living room, and has created a lot of potential for us to interact. But of course, it has also created a big negative impact on our economy. And technologies have been a major force as well to respond to what COVID-19 has brought. An example of a technology that has been developed, for example, are all the track and trace applications that help us now to foresee where there are hotspots of COVID-19, and help govern policymakers to respond and to take action where it's needed. But to allow for these track and trace applications, in a lot of countries, we had to relax data policy standards, and we had to relax data privacy. There are still also a number of countries where track and trace applications are forbidden and are not used because they are not in line with data policy standards. And also, a lot of the track and trace applications are developed on a national scale. So how do they work when we travel internationally? So a lot of kind of questions that come with developing such a new technology, that we have to think through a governance lens, and agile governance is coming in very handy here. Another example is the use of telemedicine that has really boomed in the COVID time, and has enabled us to continue to provide medical services to citizens in current society, when access to doctors is not as easy. But it also has created some issues. For example, how do you license doctors that are giving these services, and how do you make sure that one doctor in one state in the US can provide services to doctors in another state? It is also, telemedicine is also an area where the business sector has stepped up, and for example, insurance companies that are a very important actor in our health system mentioned, we are proactively including telemedicine in our insurance package to make sure that we as a business provide a good future for the clients that we serve. So there is also a big important role of businesses that to help us to develop the answers for the fourth industrial revolution. And so all of these kind of the governance principles and the governance actions that we need to take that accompany the emergence of new technologies are what we are together working on and trying to shape towards the future. Now, we shared a few examples, but it's, I think, good to go a little, to unpack what agile governance means a little bit more. And no better person that can do that for us than Stephen Almond, who has worked on this topic for a very, very long time in the UK government, and is a true expert in the domain. So, Stephen, grateful if you take it from here.
And I'm now going to move and do a bit of a focus on agile governance in the context of regulation. And you might think, well, why regulation? Of all the policy levers, why are you focusing on that? And that's because actually regulation is often one of the slowest moving levers available. Laws are deliberately set for the long term, and the array of innovation and disruption that we're seeing in today's world means that we're having to really rethink the regulatory textbook of actually how should we be making law, how should we be designing governance for the future. And so we've brought out today just 7 principles that people can be building into new governance mechanisms as they look towards the future that will help them adapt during this period of change. And the first of those is this idea of anticipatory regulation. So if we just move on to the next slide. So the idea here is that if the future is coming at you fast, you want to have the best head start that you possibly can. You want to be able to identify the implications of new technologies through horizon scanning. You want to be engaging broadly with innovators and disruptors and citizens to understand the implications. And as you're developing different policies, you want to be really understanding how resilient might this be in quite a disrupted future. And so to do that real scenario testing that I think, certainly looking back 12 months, I think a lot of government policymakers are thinking, well, actually, we would have loved to do a bit more scenario testing with how different areas of policy would respond in the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. So when we're talking about technology governance, we're seeing examples like in the UK, they've established a centre for data ethics and innovation to advise government on the implications of emerging data-driven technologies, for example. And we're seeing these sorts of centres and hotspots being introduced in all different areas of policy making. The second area that we focus on is the idea of outcome-focused regulation. Now, as government, we often tend to think, right, okay, well, we'll try and manage all of the risk out of something. We'll set some very, very detailed processes and rules. But actually, in an era of rapid technological change and significant complexity, it's a far more resilient approach is to focus rules on the achievement of outcomes and allow firms or other actors to determine best how to achieve those particular actions. And that can be really important for not just for enabling innovation in terms of how public policy goals are delivered, but also for stimulating innovation and for being able to say, right, we're setting a goal that we want to achieve X, let the market come and respond to that. Now, that always needs to be complemented with more soft ways of advising people on how to achieve those outcomes. It's not just saying good luck to business, but actually, in fact, saying in some cases, here's some guidance, here's how this could be achieved. But if you have a better idea, a different way of doing this, by all means, go ahead. And one of my favorite examples of this is a project that the World Economic Forum undertook with partners in Rwanda, where actually they opened the door to novel uses of drones to enable, in this case, drone delivery of medical supplies by working to establish a performance-based and outcome-focused regulatory regime that was really rather successful. And that ethos really brings us into the next of these principles. The next one that I'd focus on is this idea of experimental regulation, of having space for governments and for businesses to test different ways of delivering public policy goals, and to see, actually, is there a way of achieving this that might be different to the old way, that might be different to the old set of rules. And so we find that governments are establishing a whole plethora of different mechanisms to enable the testing and introduction of new ways of doing things. And that might be as simple as setting up more advisory functions to support innovators to deliver against public policy goals, and to get advice from government on just what would constitute compliance. Can they try something different? To much more sort of novel spaces, like the idea of a regulatory sandbox, which is, in effect, it's a safe place to play. It's a test environment where innovators can work with government to trial the introduction of their innovations under regulatory supervision. And so the government gets the learning on how its regulations might need to adapt to a future paradigm, and the business is able to introduce its products, hopefully much more swiftly and easily. So it's a real win-win area of thinking. And these sorts of applications can really be applied to any area of innovation, and really to stimulating innovation that governments may wish to see in terms of delivering on their goals, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. So, for example, in Singapore, they've established a sandbox for novel forms of energy that might help them in tackling climate change and enable a shift to more clean forms of growth. Now, the shift to that new way of operating requires, again, another shift in terms of how governments regulate. And this is the idea of being able to respond more responsively to changes that are seen. If you're going to give businesses a lot of freedom in terms of how they achieve policy goals, you need to be able to much better survey what's going on and potentially intervene and adapt your rules, or in some cases drive enforcement to make sure that those outcomes are continuing to be achieved. And actually, this is another area where the fourth industrial revolution can be really helpful, because there is now an absolute wealth of technologies that are available now that can make the business of surveying what's going on in the real world and taking, in some cases, automated decisions much more easy. And so we're seeing a sort of a real shift in that. The other area that I would sort of focus on in relation to this is thinking about the role of private sector governance. So we're seeing increased, I would say, kind of literacy within government in terms of how they can work with industry and with other partners to support greater self-governance and co-governance of risks that are emerging from new technology. And so that might be fostering the development of industry standards, or codes of practice, or other mechanisms that actually are much more nimble than the law can be in terms of responding to change and disruption. But retaining a quizzical eye on those mechanisms and making sure that they are genuinely agile and that they're not just cementing a status quo through other means. And so it's again another area that we're seeing for policymakers in particular is a real priority to upskill on. And for the businesses, there is obviously significant opportunity in terms of being able to demonstrate that they are responsible businesses that are trying to achieve public policy goals, but doing it in a different and potentially a better way. And there's a lovely example here around Netflix, for example, which was able to work with a range of different content providers within the video on demand industry to develop a self-regulatory industry content code that would enable the online streaming of new films and new services in a way that moved us on significantly from the idea of kind of government approving content that is made available in the cinema, for example, and took this into a much more flexible, novel sort of area for the future. Now, the last two areas that I would focus on are really tackling what Chris framed as that coordination challenge. First up, one of the areas that we're really encouraging people to focus on is coordination within government, and that might be between different ministries, that might be across states, that might be within all different levels of government. But actually, if you are seeing this very broad-based wave of technological change, you really need tools to be able to ensure a coordinated government position that is better able to manage risks and to seize some of the opportunities that arise. And so we're seeing things emerge, like in Denmark, for example, an idea of a one-stop shop for new business models. So for businesses that are looking to try something that's really quite different to the ordinary, being able to go into a single point of contact within government that then brings together all of the different government interests to make sure that they are wonderfully coordinated and that there is a coherent position. And actually, as Chris mentioned earlier on, the fact that we are seeing new technologies emerge in so many different domains right now with so many potential uses means that that sort of coordination across government is just vital. Last of the principles, and then maybe we'll pause to come in for a couple of questions before moving on to Nima, is this idea of international regulatory cooperation, which is basically it's the same idea as the last one, but written across the international sphere. If we're looking at enabling new technologies to come forward, if there are very different rules that exist in different jurisdictions across the world, what we risk creating in some cases will be a series of novel barriers that inhibits the development of technology at scale and its ability to solve genuine problems across the globe. We also risk creating competition among governments where actually we take a slightly lax approach to standards for things because we're trying to compete and create the most innovation enabling environment. And actually that might serve us well in the very short run, but is not very good for any jurisdiction in the long term. And so there's a whole range of opportunities for governments to work much more closely on the governance of innovation. And we're seeing networks emerge like in the financial sector. There is a new global financial innovation network which brings together over 50 different regulators to really work together between countries to make sure that rules are coherent and that innovators are able to introduce the same sorts of technologies in one jurisdiction as they are in another, and then help spread some of these beneficial new technologies more widely across the globe. I'll pause there, having given you an awful lot in terms of the 7 different principles, and then maybe pick up in a moment.
Wonderful, Chris and Stephen. And I see that our audience the members of our audience have many questions, including some that I anticipate Nima will be answering. So perhaps let me, for example, Simran spoke about the potentially Eurocentric narrative of the multiple industrial revolutions. So, and then I know that Nima has written extensively on some of those questions, and I think Felix as well has spoken about the fact that the approach is very developed and in advanced economies. However, in some of the emerging or developing one, they are still struggling with the first, second, and third industrial revolution, let alone the fourth industrial revolution. And Renuka has also spoken about the ability really of the fourth industrial revolution to protect the indigenous people right. So Nima, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lanre. Some very, very good questions from the audience, and thank you, Stephen and Chris, for the introduction to the concept for our audience. I want to touch upon some issues, just kind of summarizing Chris and Stephen, and building upon and hopefully touching upon some of the questions that we've been seeing in the chat box. First and foremost, I think one of the key things to take away from this discussion is the fundamental need of a change in mindset. This is why there is a lot of discussion, and the fourth industrial revolution was not only the theme of Davos for the World Economic Forum back in 2016, but has been written extensively on by our executive chairman, Klaus Schwab. And here in particular, the change in mindset is the fundamental understanding that innovation is not just about technology, but it is just as much about regulation and governance. So for the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution Network, for us, we adopt a very focused approach around human-centered agile project methodology. That's rather verbose. What does that really mean? It means we adopt a proactive attitude to how technology should be governed. We identify governance gaps which inhibit technology innovation or act as a barrier to technology dissemination. And we co-design these projects between public and private sector, including civil society and academia, to ensure we have as close to a complete understanding about the governance gap. And in practicing what we preach, agile governance is very much the mindset we adopt there. And so through this agile thinking, we also pilot the work that we do. We pilot the policies in the jurisdictions of partner governments to ensure that the policies are not only fit for purpose, but they also enable us to have real-time learnings and iterate as we pilot. As such, we do adopt a very do-tank or applied research approach. And I think through doing, we have been able to change the minds that, including the UK government. The second key takeaway I would say is actually a point that both Chris and Stephen touched upon, which is the fact that COVID-19 has reinforced the importance of governments in our daily lives in spite of the fourth industrial revolution, right? Whilst millions are using technologies and technology platforms in their daily existence to connect with each other, including ourselves right now, in times of crisis, the buck stops often with our governments. And so we've seen that governments where they've been needed to have been able to make fast-paced policy shifts, including telemedicines and e-scooters, as Stephen alluded to. And I think this is important to show that governments really aren't as far behind as we think they are when it comes to agile policy making, but that doesn't mean that they're at a place where they are at the forefront. There's still a long way to go, but I think we're getting a bit closer to where we need to be. The third point I would raise is around the nature of technology in and of itself being borderless. And here, whether we like it or not, the nations that will win or lose in harnessing the power of technology will really depend on how agile they are in their mindset and their ability. As the forum, we're very much focused around building communities of purpose and action, particularly in our Global Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution Network, where we have facilitated communities such as the Global AI Action Alliance and our Global Digital Currencies Consortiums that not only facilitate peer learning and knowledge sharing, but also allow us to distill global standards for the regulation of key emerging technologies. Building on that, I would say that technology governance must become closer to global standards akin to international human rights. In this context, we're talking about the SDGs. And I think whilst national and regional regulation is important, true agility means we've all got to be on the same playing field when we're talking about the development and use of key technologies, whether AI and machine learning, blockchain, drones, etc. I think Stephen alluded to regulatory sandboxes, particularly in the fintech space, which has now been adopted in over 45 nations, with 24 currently live, according to Columbia Business School's latest research, of which 10 are in developing nations, which is progress, but not as much progress as we need. And so to enable us to be on the same playing field, I think it is important that we talk about capacity building. And in particular, ensuring that we are able to empower civil servants around the world to think differently about their roles as regulators and to understand and adopt Agile principles. Apolitical is a non-profit we've been working with, who've put out a number of studies targeting civil servants and their digital capabilities, as well as facilitate peer learning. And what we're seeing is that emerging economies are at an advantage because they can look at all of the approaches that have been adopted around the world and select the best one, right? The most advanced one, if they want to adopt those approaches. Yet at the same time, they are at a disadvantage because of the limited access to digital infrastructure in some nations and digital capabilities of those civil servants. So again, we do have a long way to go. And when it comes to global technology governance, by adopting an agile mindset and innovating in policymaking, we can get closer to global cohesion when it comes to regulating emerging technologies. And I think agility for many is a scary concept because they think it does have that cost benefit. But in reality, I think through peer exchange and through applied research that we're adopting in the C4IR network, we are at a place where we can make these innovations in incremental ways that doesn't create too many risks for nations, but it definitely enhances the benefits of technologies. And just to touch upon specifically the question around whether it's a Eurocentric narrative, I think the reality is everybody is using technology. There are just as many people who are using technologies in emerging economies, not as much as in the advanced economies, but one thing that it could be is an equalizer for all if it's harnessed correctly. And I think that's what we're trying to facilitate as the World Economic Forum, not only through our C4IR network, but more generally in our initiatives, is to be able to create that even playing field for public-private collaboration and making sure that that narrative is not just Eurocentric, but as relevant and as prosperous for emerging economies. Let me pause there.
So let me ask a few questions. So I will engage as well with the question of the audience. So as they are aligned with core issues, how might the fourth industrial revolution impact income, class, or racial gap? And will the introduction of such technology sharpen this gap? How do we ensure that the new technologies are mindful of potential societal gaps? That's a question from Simran. So I will give you the floor to whoever wants to jump first.
Kick off, and then Chris and Stephen, you can jump in. I think the last question around, you know, how can we ensure that the fourth industrial revolution and emerging technologies does benefit society is fundamentally what we're looking at the C4IR network. For us, I think it is crucial to understand that technology is a real conduit for social change and economic prosperity, used in a proper fashion if regulated well. And I think that is the challenge that we're facing today, which is that regulation is not able to keep pace with the speed at which we are innovating. And this is very much why we as the World Economic Forum put out a white paper back in 2018 where we called for the adoption of an adaptive, human-centered, inclusive and sustainable policy-making approach, which is how we define agile governance as a barometer for how these technologies should be regulated to not only facilitate technology innovation rather than stifle it, but also ensure that we are providing access for those innovations that are beneficial for society whilst minimizing the risks of those same technologies from undermining our current social cohesion.
Thank you. And I might just sort of build on that. I would say ultimately technology inherently, I would argue, is not good or bad, but it's how it's used. And consequently, that then translates to how it's governed. And if we are going to shape a future where technology is used for good and is used to reduce inequality and to reduce social harms, then governments and industry need to be quite active about shaping that future, whether it's on issues such as algorithmic bias, whether it's on issues such as how gene editing, for example, might be used. And that's what I would really want to hammer home in terms of what an agile governance approach means. It doesn't mean, it's not code for deregulation. It's not code for government just stepping back and saying, let's see how things evolve. But actually what it is being really clear about what the outcomes are that are really important and providing really sort of clear signals to everybody involved about, well, actually, how do we want to shape the future of technology to achieve those particular goals? In line with that, I wanted to come back to one of the comments that I've seen come up, which is about the extent to which this is a developed country approach, to put it as it's been described in the comments. And I would really beg to differ with that. Just as Nima is saying earlier, actually, I think there is an enormous opportunity here for emerging economies in the way that several emerging economies have been able to leapfrog some of their counterparts in some areas of technology development. So think of things like mobile payments, for example, in parts of Africa, where actually not having a load of legacy infrastructure has meant that they've been able to develop a very different approach. Actually, I think the same is true of governance and the law. And you'll find that many of the more sort of established economies, for example, in parts of Europe, will have very, very detailed statute books, which will require painstaking revision in order to enable emerging technology. And actually, other countries may be able to leapfrog and take a different approach because they do not have that entrenched system.
Just one element on the to complement this. There is indeed a big need for additional governance, and therefore it's great to, especially in this week, to see the efforts that the UN is also taking in this respect. There have been tremendous efforts by the Secretary General to put digital collaboration high on the agenda. There is a roadmap and the different work streams that are taken forward by different countries, and a great recognition and willingness to work on that. So that's really encouraging, and we really work with the UN to skill them and to try to share some examples that we think are useful to take up at a higher scale.
Absolutely, and probably to add also a few illustration on both the fourth industrial revolution and sometimes agile governance. So people may not necessarily connect them, but whether we speak about zip line in Rwanda with drone delivery of blood, of medication, zipline, as a matter of fact, was not allowed in California, but the government of Rwanda was agile enough to adopt the innovation, to regulate it properly, and now it is being disseminated in additional countries, whether Uganda, Tanzania, among other. But we can also speak about some of the applications. M-Pesa, everyone already know M-Pesa and speaks about M-Pesa all the time, so that is an illustration which is obvious. But Gifted Mom, for example, using application on the continent in Africa to really help maternal health, newborn health, by providing information, timely information, and also helping coordinating with the healthcare system. You also have Will and Brothers, for example, also using drone for cartography and to improve agricultural productivity. And those innovations have also required new regulation for testing, but also for successful implementation, let alone CardioPad, the CardioPad, which is a tablet allowing to consult patients who have health cardiac conditions in countries where we have a limited number of cardiologists, for example, and connecting especially rural and urban centers. So those innovation, the fourth industrial revolution, it is not just a story of advanced economies in many emerging economies, developing countries, including in fighting COVID-19. Artificial intelligence, big data has been used in numerous African countries, Nigeria, among others. So it's really important to not think that it is just a matter of advanced economy, but emerging economies are also critical in those processes. So perhaps let me ask a question. Can you provide a few concrete illustration for some members of the audience who may want to see how agile governance has been used in whether national or local policy making processes? And Stephen, you may eventually be starting, and of course, Chris and Nima are happy to have also your perspective on this.
Of course. Related to this, I saw a really interesting question in the chat box around how what sorts of projects are now emerging in the context of the COVID crisis. And Nima hinted at a really interesting project that's just taken place not far from where I am at in the UK right now, where actually the government has seen the opportunity of new forms of mobility to enable people to get around in different ways whilst people are trying to social distance. And so they've established things like e-scooters, where they have done that in a very agile way, getting the trials up and running really quite quickly and saying, look, we're going to be really frank with everybody. These are trials for a fixed term period, and we are going to learn from them. And from that, we're going to develop the regulatory regime in based on that learning, which is very, very different to the traditional government model of we'll take this problem away and we'll sit on it for a while and we'll work it through and we'll get the perfect evidence base and then we'll develop the policy. This is actually looking and saying, right, actually, how can we get the learning in this unique time, really challenging time, and develop a regime that is right for the future? And I think it's those sorts of projects that there's a great opportunity for now. I was speaking with colleagues, for example, in the UAE, who said, actually, this is we should seize this as a time to really think about how to bring agile governance more into our day-to-day, because it's really needed right now.
Great. I also like to share an example that connects outcome-focused regulation with experimentation, and it's one related to helping to find environmental solutions. The government of the Netherlands created a call for proposal stating that they wanted to invite civil citizens and also businesses to provide solutions for helping the environment. So that was their call for an outcome-focused solution. It had to be environment-based solutions, and they were reaching out and were inviting businesses and individuals to mention where current regulation was in the way of putting in place innovations, with the commitment that the government would then work with those businesses or innovators to solve those bottlenecks. So a way to really crowdsource ideas from the population. But I also want to mention another example that I really like from a developing context in South Africa, where due to COVID, a lot of the auctions of cattle was not able to take place anymore. And a company based in South Africa called BKB designed a solution for online auctions of cattle. And that really increased the efficiency also of the supply chain, because there was a third less transportation that was needed in the life cycle of cattle. And that then in turn also had a positive effect on the CO2 footprint of the country. So it's an example where we are, where the government and the business work together to define a solution for one problem, but there were unintended consequences and unintended benefits for also other applications, such as the environment. So I think it's a great example of how ecosystems fit together and how technology can help us to solve several challenges in our society.
So Nima, I will give you the floor first, but I want to bring many questions and give you the final round of answer. Nima having a longer time to answer, and then the order perhaps just like 30 seconds or so. So an extremely important question has been asked a few times about how those agile solutions could help eradicate gender inequality, both by Sylvia and by Elizabeth. So this is an extremely important question, and Nima, you have done work around those. And perhaps the other questions that I want you to touch also in your closing remark, maybe what is next? Some are speaking eventually about the fifth industrial revolution, or how COVID is accelerating agile governance. So I think those for your final words, because we should have a hard stop. Nima first.
Thank you, Lanre. I'll spend a couple of minutes just quickly on this. On the question around gender equality, I think the tools we highlighted in our white paper from a couple of years ago talks about crowdsourcing. And I think crowdsourcing is a great way for governments to really think differently about policymaking, particularly whether they have hackathons, and we've seen a number of jurisdictions adopting this approach during COVID-19 to try and identify solutions. And I think that makes the opportunity for citizens to engage with their governments, and particularly women, a little bit more than the norm, given that we still aren't at gender parity when it comes to working in government or in industry, unfortunately, around the world. On the fifth industrial revolution, it's really interesting. The Japanese government has a really big push around Society 5.0. So there are a number of jurisdictions that are already thinking ahead. We are really still at the precipice of the fourth industrial revolution, and whilst technology is innovating relatively quickly, I think we need to be able to really leverage how we harness the current technologies before we even get into a dynamic around how we regulate quantum computing, which is still for many decades away.
I'll
perhaps one sentence of conclusion by Stephen and Chris.
Two responses. One, change up who's in the room in terms of who gets to be involved in making decisions, and you get different and you get better decisions. And two, in terms of kind of what's next on agile governance, missions, focusing on tackling genuine challenges and rallying people around how to tackle those specific challenges.
And my 2 cents, I hope that the next revolution is not an industrial revolution, but a social revolution, where we are creating better ways to work together, to be comfortable with failing, to allow creativity and joint work to move our society forward.
Thank you so much, Chris, Stephen, Nima, for this wonderful panel. I would also like to thank our leader, Dean Tagram, but also our fabulous team member, Kelly, Derek, Megan, Anne, Jennifer, and all the other fabulous staff members who have contributed to this session, and looking forward to continuing the interaction with you. This session is closed.